Well, hey, Richard. Thanks for taking some time to sit down.
Not a problem. My name is Richard Flamer, and I've been in Central America for the better part of 30 years now. 8 years in Guatemala, 2 years in El Salvador, various visits through Honduras, and some years in Nicaragua. I currently live in Chiapas, Mexico, where my wife and I have a small Catholic worker farm. I ended up working quite a bit in Chiapas, largely because of the bishop, Samuel Ruiz, who's one of my heroes. I first started with a trip to the refugee camps in Mexico of Guatemalan refugees. It would have been 82, 83, somewhere in there. I eventually went back 8 times over the course of 8 years into those camps. There were 90,000 Guatemalan refugees living in the camps. Don Samuel Ruiz, the bishop there, ended up raising, in the end, almost $1 million a month to maintain those refugees. And he used my photos to raise the money in Europe. So that was my introduction, really, to Chiapas. What I discovered was that so many of those refugees had fled the fighting in Guatemala, 30-year war, which was in many cases a genocidal war with the Indians, because of the Indians. And then I later followed that up with working for Archbishop Gerardi in Guatemala, who ran a forensic team to cover the mass graves, and later published in a work called Nunca Más, or Never Again. That work was illuminating in the sense that I then understood why there were so many refugees in Mexico. The first grave I worked at was a place called Rio Negro, where 750 women, children, and old people were massacred by paramilitary squads. The reason ostensibly was that all the men were gone, so they must be guerrillas. That was the reason the army sent them, supposedly. The fact of the matter was that a colonel at a nearby base owned the land on the side of where these people lived, in this village, and wanted the land that the people occupied. So with the massacre, he then took over the land to increase his land holdings. The women and children that were killed were largely young. The children were taken by the heels and beaten against rocks. The women were forced to dance and have sex with the soldiers, and when they tired of them, they shot them, buried them in a mass grave there. The second grave was at a place in lower Coban, where 96 women and children and old people were killed. And there, the women and children were all herded into a barn and doused with gasoline, and grenades were thrown inside. And when we uncovered the graves, one mass grave, there were still children at the breast of the mothers, which indicated that they'd been alive when they were burned alive. And so I went back, going back to Mexico to work in the refugee camps. And for the most part, those people in the refugee camps were simply trying to live their lives. The work I'm doing now in Guatemala is with repatriated refugees in a camp or in a town where they recuperated their land because of a NGO, a group out of Switzerland that helped them buy their land back. That group are all Chu Indians, C-H-U-J. Before the war in Guatemala, there were 36,000 Chu families in that village, and in the surrounding area, there are now a total of only 3,000. The rest were all killed during the Civil War. I wandered off and on into Honduras, where the effects of the U.S. military were really extreme. The Contra War in Nicaragua propped up the Honduran economy in a big, big way, not just with arms, but also with the American soldiers who were assigned to the region, and the buildup of bases, that sort of thing. When the Americans pulled out, they left a shattered economy that was more driven by the dollar than the lempira, their national currency. And frankly, they couldn't have done the arms deals or the bases had it not been for the corruption. So the corruption grew as the U.S. presence grew in the region. When the Panama Canal was given back to the Panamanians, the major U.S. intelligence base for all of Latin America had been in that region, in the Panama Canal zone. That base got moved completely to a place called Swan Island off the coast of Honduras. There is still an American presence there, but it's relatively small in comparison to the time of the Nicaraguan Revolution. But one of the things I've noticed all the way through is that American presence has ruined the lives and the economies of each of those countries. In El Salvador, the dollar has replaced the local currency. The U.S. still is building a new base there. But the revolution was partly successful in that there has been some land redistribution. But by and large, it was a proxy war that the U.S. kept putting all this money and all this effort into El Salvador. And in the middle of all that, you had migration to the U.S. Of Salvadorans who didn't want to be caught up in the war. So they fled to the U.S., many of them to Southern California. And at the time, the Crips and the Bloods, or the gangs, were just starting to gain sway in Southern California. As a self-defense measure, the Mara Salvatrucha and the gangs from Latin America were formed originally to defend themselves against the Bloods and the Crips, because they all lived in the same areas. They were all poor. Towards the end of the Salvadoran War and after the peace accords in '92, the U.S. started shipping all these gang kids back to El Salvador. That's the beginnings of gangs in Latin America. They shipped these kids who in many cases had only Spanglish. They didn't speak any Spanish proper because they'd been raised in LA. On one occasion, I was in a town called Nuevo Gualcho in El Salvador. After the peace accords had been signed and a group of expatriates had come back to El Salvador, the settlement had been composed of ex-military soldiers and their families and these refugees, largely guerrilla families, and they were getting along. And the police force, the local police force, was made up of half and half, so that there'd be some kind of justice in the community. And I went there to see how it was functioning and so forth. And I was sitting on the porch of a general store, which was sort of the meeting place of the community, when two gang kids came up. One started in his usual chatter about this woman, this good-looking woman who was there. And this little boy, who obviously belonged to the woman, went running for his father, who was an ex-guerrilla commander. And the father came back with a machete and cut the man's head off. And the local police came from both sides, and the comandante, the commander, explained what had happened, and the storekeeper confirmed it. So the police said to the other gangbanger, "Bury your friend and leave. Get out of here. This never happened." That was the original greeting of these gang members. The problem is that the gangs grew in large part because of the injustice, especially relating to orphans and street kids, kids who had single parents. Their father died in the war, or they never knew him. In Guatemala, the same sort of thing took hold after the war, when people don't realize that a war has effects that last for literally generations. And so there was such a displacement in Guatemala that you'd see all these gang kids and orphans on the street in Guatemala City. What's been happening is that Honduras has passed some laws about gang members and basically pushed them out of Honduras into Guatemala. El Salvador is trying to do the same thing now. And in Guatemala, the Indian or indigenous villages don't accept them, so they push them farther north. The bulk of the gang members are from Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, are now on the Mexican-Guatemalan frontier. Mexico tried to respond by building prisons, 3 new ones along that border, and they were filled within a year. The poverty is in part, a big part, from the corruption. The money that goes to Honduras or El Salvador goes to the big, rich families. On the other hand, you have problems with other folks who the influence of the American conglomerates is still big, so that you have Coca-Cola asking for and getting money from the local governments for putting in a bottling plant. and then bringing their own hand-selected people in to run it, who are not from the region. In Guatemala today, for the first time in the history of Guatemala that I know of, you now have 30% of the assembly, the National Assembly, that are represented by Indians, indigenous people. You're talking about 65% of the population who, prior to the war, prior to the ending of the war, had no representation in Congress, none. So some of that is changing, but it's a slow process. There's also the big problem with so many people lost in the wars. At one point in Nicaragua, for example, I went into a village that was 150 families and only 18 men, and the rest had died in the war. So what do those women do? Well, in some cases, they're empowered. The Sandinista government actually had a plan for those women, and it was fairly successful. But nowadays, you still have that problem in Guatemala, though the war's been over since 1992. Or you have the problem of Yalan Bahosh, where I go and do my work, of families, 300 families who lived in refugee camps for over 25 years. They had education, but they weren't allowed to work. So they couldn't even do subsistence farming. So all of a sudden they're back in Guatemala, and what do? Even in Mexico now, in our little community of 112 families, we've had 8 young men go to the U.S. or try to get to the U.S. In each case, they had a primary school education so they could read and write, but there were no opportunities for work. One young man was working with me for a while, and the daily wage, and he was really happy with it actually, was 150 pesos. The minimum wage is 75 pesos, or at that time $5, and he was getting paid $10 a day. But he decided to go when he had his second child. He wanted something better for his wife and children. They were still living in the home of his parents. He eventually made it to Knoxville, Tennessee, where he's currently working as a dishwasher. He has sent home enough money so that his wife could build a house on their land. And his plan is not to stay there, but to get enough money for tools and take everything down to Chiapas and open his own carpentry shop. On the other hand, of those 8, 3 were killed along the way and bodies sent back. 2 others have essentially disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them along the way. They might well be working on the border in one of the maquiladoras plants, but nobody knows for sure. With the advent of cell phones, there is a better communication. So some have called back and said, look, I didn't make it the first time, but I made it the second time, and I'm here in Texas, or whatever. We get people coming through. We're only 150 meters off the Pan American Highway, our farm. For a couple of years, we took in migrant girls I recall two sisters who were 14 and 15, and they were both pregnant. They had been in a village that got inundated from floods, and the bulk of the people died. They set out on foot towards the border and got picked up by the gangs and were used. And when the gang members, when the girls are pregnant, they throw them out. So these two girls had walked, for us in a car, it's 4 hours to the border. And they had walked from the border to our place. And all they had on were panties and a t-shirt, both pregnant. We took them in, and we had taken other girls in along the way as well. But those two stand out in my mind. Got them clothes and eventually helped them have their babies in town in San Cristobal. And they're both still working there now. But they've had to learn Spanish along the way because they're both indigenous. They had to learn Spanish, and they had to have their babies, and they were young, and they're doing okay. But the problem is that there are so many, and they have all the usual problems in Mexico, in southern Mexico. Oh, they're going to take our jobs, and they're a burden on the society and all that sort of thing. And what we found is they're doing the work that the Mexicans don't want to do, and picking fruit, that sort of thing, and getting half the pay that the Mexicans would normally get. The caravans were formed as a kind of self-defense because of the drug lords. The drug lords have consistently, over the last 10 years anyway, used or tried to use migrants as mules to bring the drugs across. There's a region in San Fernando up near the border where Mexican immigration people who were checking buses would pull the migrants off and sell them to the drug people. And the drug dealers would house them at a farm, and one group of drug dealers told these migrants that they were going to be mules, and they had no choice in the matter. And they all refused, and so they were all killed, all 76. Two guys managed to escape. Under the bodies, they were hurt, but managed to escape and tell the tale. Those kinds of reasons are the reasons for caravans proper. That there were so many single men who were picked up by the gangs and used as fodder, cannon fodder. So roughly about 10 years ago, they started forming caravans to go. All the caravans start out in large numbers and end up being relatively small by the time they hit the border. And part of that is Mexico's effort to incorporate some of the people into their culture. Mexico City is so huge that any of the individuals can pretty well fit in there. And there are large areas of Mexico City that are nothing but Hondurans originally. Another group that's nothing but Guatemalans originally. So that many of them only want to get to Mexico City. What happens along the way is that, like in this particular large caravan, in which the news is fixed on, it started out to be 7,000 supposedly. My mother-in-law in Oaxaca last week sent me a text that she and her neighbors cooked for the caravan, and they got a guy to donate a cow, and they for 3 days did a barbecue of along the way, and that's pretty much the response of the people proper. But she was saying that at their place the estimate was that there were only 3,000, and that people were peeling off all the time to go to Mexico City, to go to Veracruz, where they happen to have relatives or something of that nature. And amongst my friends back in Chiapas, we're estimating that by the time it gets to the border, it'll be less than 1,000. The other thing that's really important to stress is that most of these people would not leave their country if they didn't have to. I talked to a Honduran woman whose oldest boy got drafted into the gangs when they came through her village, and she had these great fears for her daughter and her other son, and just felt like there was no escape from the gang activity. So she took the 2 surviving children and herself up, and didn't join that caravan, but came earlier. But that's often the case. And my own sense is people are coming here not because they necessarily want to. They just don't see any alternatives from where they are. The other thing that's important to remember, for example, the Mexican migrants who come up, in large part, they're like my friend Pedro in Knoxville. They only want to come up to make enough money to have a decent life in Mexico. And I would be really surprised if Pedro stayed more than 8 or 9 years. And by then he'd have enough money saved and to buy his tools and so forth. And that's not unusual. I mean, in our community we have 3 now men who've come back, and one just builds fireplaces. Was a mason's assistant. Well, the kid's got work all over the place. Those who've come back have had some sort of education or a skill that they've developed, and they're doing relatively well. And that's pretty common, not just in our community, but also in places like San Cristobal, the bigger cities. The rich in San Cristobal and the surrounding area always look for, before they used to just say, give me the cheapest price, give me the cheapest workers you have. And they're not saying that anymore. They're saying, wait a minute, we're looking for people who've been to the States and who've learned their craft, and those are the people we want to hire. Well, that's the solution. I mean, in one part of the solution. It seems to me that with the education.
What would you say to folks here currently, worried about this horde of whatever the president's...
I would say it's fucking absurd.
Yeah.
It to me, don't people ever think about immigration historically? I mean, the Chinese came over with the gold rush when the U.S. needed labor. And they had quotas at that time. So when they would refuse entry for the ships, and those same Chinese would go farther south to Mexico. And when Mexico decided they didn't want any more Chinese, they'd send it farther south. Well, Honduras has over 25,000 Chinese restaurants in Tegucigalpa. And that's all the Chinese Hondurans who came to clear the swamps. The Japanese went to Bolivia, to Peru. The Irish went to Veracruz. They had the same quotas in Boston and New York. When the Irish stepped off the ship, they said, "Are you going to join the Civil War or go back?" And in many cases, those Irish went to Veracruz, Mexico. Everywhere, they're all built on immigration. And they're really some of the best citizens that I've ever encountered. Citizens, there's a young man who's just down 3 doors from here who has worked hard enough to save and buy a house, and it was a wreck. This kid's a great carpenter. Well, it's not a wreck anymore. It's a really beautiful house, now with a fence. And it seems to me that they're a real treasure. I was involved with the Civil Liberties Union in Nebraska when the last immigration major changes occurred. And they were talking to the sugar beet growers out there about picking sugar beets, and that these employers would get fined if they hired people without a green card. And so the first crop came due, and the growers lost millions. And the second year, they said, it ain't happening. I don't care if you find me, but I got to get my sugar beets out of the ground, and I can't find naturalized citizens who are going to do that. And the sugar beet growers as a group all stood together and said, no, we don't care. We want the sugar beets out of the ground. I was just reading about a welding shop in Texas that has rough welders. They make trailers. And people in the town are furious because there was a raid by ICE, and they lost 1/3 of the employees. And so the factories had to shut down because they can't get anybody to work. And that's ruined the economy of a small town. Well, there's lots of welders coming up. You know, there's some good carpenters coming up. And they're a big wealth to this country. And the women, they work so hard, and great folks. I have never seen a Middle Easterner in any of those countries. And the gang members are not about to march with a group like that. Those people are marching in Caravan, in a group, so that the gang members won't come near them. And it seems to me that this rhetoric is just awful. It's just atrocious. A demagogue, that's what he is. I don't know what to say. I mean, I come up here from Chiapas, and I don't understand it. We live with the poor, and we're not poor. We're rich. We really are rich. And I come up here and I look around and I don't understand it. I don't get it. I mean, it's just, I think I must be stupid or something. I don't understand it. Yeah. And the only thing I can say is that I personally feel like I'm the most blessed guy in the world, that I get to be amongst those people. The people of Guatemala, the people of Salvador. My wife's an indigenous woman from Mexico. I just feel like I have the best life in the world.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah.